We're continuing our study in systematic theology. This is lesson number 23, part 2, concluding the doctrine of Christian giving. Many ministers preached on tithing, using the Old Testament patriarchs as an example of pledging 10% of their increases to God. They do this while reminding us we should be doing this in a cheerful attitude and for the right reason. I've heard, and hopefully this is just an old wives' tale, of a church needing a certain amount of money for fundraising, and then passing the collection plates around and around and around until they finally reach that goal. If this is true, this is a despicable action. And we can see how something like that could cause members to quit going to church. Collections have always been voluntary, and that's the way they're meant to be. Because only then can one cheerfully give and expect to be blessed in the same way that God wants to bless us. If you're dropping a $10 bill into a plate to get the minister to shut up, that's not going to be blessed like it would if you gave it because you wanted to. Then when that minister shuts up, you have your reward. In the last part, we covered that the rich aren't to be high-minded, that the blessing of having money should not make one arrogant. We've seen the congregations of a New Testament church who can financially help out a needy New Testament church should do so whenever possible. We've learned that the poor members should receive help when possible by the churches they attend. Emphasis on whenever possible. The concept of tithing is Old Testament, and it included much more than just basing the tithe on your paycheck. Finally, we covered that when you freely give, you will be blessed in greater abundance than your gift. And now we'll continue with the conclusion to the doctrine of Christian giving. Question 7. Who receives the greater blessing of a gift? When I was young, it always seemed like Christmas would take forever to get here. I learned as I got older that it got here faster and faster. But the longest year I ever experienced was 1969, because just a few days after Christmas 1968, I knew what I wanted for Christmas the next year. And to get it, I knew the rules, at least the rules in our family. I had to be good, and I could not tell anybody about this gift. And it would be a wonderful present. Something I constantly imagined getting, using, and being the envy of those who were not me. I didn't know if I could share it or not because I didn't know how the upkeep on it worked, but everyone would hope that I did share it. So I sat on this secret for what seemed like the longest year ever, never telling anyone, which is quite an accomplishment for a 7-year-old. But that was the rule, and for this present, it was worth the effort to keep the rule. Finally, December was here, and my dad asked me what I wanted for Christmas. I knew I'd follow the rules given to me. So with a big smile and all the confidence in the world, I told him, "Daddy, I want an icy machine." My dad then proceeded to crush my dreams. "I can't get that for you." "But Daddy, I followed the rules." He then gently, lovingly, and tactfully as he could, explained the reasons this was not going to happen. I ended up getting a football and a Boy Scout knife that year, and although disappointed, I survived without being scarred for life. At that age, it was all about the getting of the gift. A few years later, we were expected to start buying gifts for others. Getting for others up to that point was Mom and Dad buying stuff and putting our names on it. Once it was our money we were spending, we found that it was easier giving something to someone we liked, but we had been taught to be fair. We also learned it was fun watching someone open a gift we had given them just to watch their expression. And yes, it meant more when you worked to earn the money for their gift. We were learning that it was fun to give. As we got older and as families expanded and our roles in the family shifted, we looked at the Christmas presents differently. As an adult, I no longer care about the receiving part of the presents, but we all delight in watching the younger ones rip through all the effort we spend wrapping a present just so they can see what's inside. Their joy is so genuine and infectious that the feeling of giving outshines the feeling of receiving every time. And this feeling is about any gift, not just Christmas. Who receives a greater blessing of a gift? Acts 20:35. "I have shewed you all things, how that so laboring ye ought to support the weak, and to remember the words of the Lord Jesus, how he said, It is more blessed to give than to receive." Question 8. With what attitude should we give? Collections are voluntary. If they are commanded, our attitude toward them wouldn't matter. We'd just be obeying a commandment. Many ministries might frown at this attitude concerning collections, but remember Paul's wording in his first epistle to the church at Corinth. 1 Corinthians chapter 16 and verse 2, Upon the first day of the week, let every one of you lay by him in store as God has prospered him, that there be no gatherings when I come. The Greek word, or let, used here is the word tithemi. The word tithemi is passive, not like the Greek word histemi, the active form. Where the collection's a commandment, the active word, histemi, would have been used. God wishes all collections to be given because we wish to give, not because we are forced to. Giving to God should not produce the same effect as paying the power bill. And by that I mean it isn't set to be thought of as a necessary evil made essential by some unfeeling bunch of committees who want nothing better to do than to separate us from our money. If we believe in what we're doing as we offer our collections, and if we believe our collections are aiding the advancement of God's Great Commission, then we should be happy to be part of this. Our collections tie us into the mission work that the local New Testament church is part of, and we will be greatly rewarded for this. With what attitude should we give? 2 Corinthians chapter 9, beginning of verse 6. But this I say, he which soweth sparingly shall reap also sparingly, and he which soweth bountifully shall reap also bountifully. Every man according as he proposeth in his heart, so let him give, not grudgingly or of necessity, for God loveth a cheerful giver. Question 9. What promise is made to the generous soul? We cannot outgive God. In both Malachi 3:10 and Luke 6:38, we see that when we give, we receive more than what we contribute. Both of these verses are promises made by Jesus, because he is the Lord of hosts, Adonai Shabbat, in the Old Testament. Just a reminder of what these verses say. Malachi 3:10, bring ye all the tithes into the storehouse, that there may be meat in mine house, and prove me not herewith, saith the Lord of hosts, if I will not open you the windows of heaven, and pour you out a blessing, that there shall not be room enough to receive it. Luke 6:38, give, and it shall be given unto you, good measure, pressed down, and shaken together, and running over, shall men give into your bosom. For with the same measure that ye mete withal, it shall be measured to you again. Both of these verses show that the more generous you are, the more you will be blessed. He who has the cattle of 1,000 hills and enough gold that he paves his roads with it, has promised that you cannot outgive him. As both promises are made by the commander of God's army, Jesus, look to the phrase, prove me, recorded in Malachi. The Hebrew word here is bakan, and its meanings include to examine, to test, to prove, or to place on trial. None of these definitions express any fear of being proven wrong. Not only does God want us to be cheerful givers, but he wants us to know that when we give, he will take care of us in return, not just in heaven, but here on earth as well. What promise is made to the generous soul? Proverbs 11:25, the barakah soul shall be made fat, and he that watereth shall be watered also himself. The word barakah here is translated as liberal. Unfortunately, that word's kind of been hijacked and has a different meaning now. The liberal soul, or the generous soul, shall be made fat. Question 10. Who is the most generous giver? There are many different views of God's behavior out there. Some see the God of the Old Testament as different from the God of the New Testament. One is viewed as being vindictive, judgmental, and quick to punish, while the other is seen as more loving, compassionate, and forgiving. There's even someone who claims to be a Baptist preacher that's teaching this now. He is a shame to us. But the God of the Old Testament is the same God as the God of the New Testament. Somehow, though, many still picture God the same way that Muslims picture the God they refer to as Allah, as distant, dispassionate, and more an observer than an interactor with us. They say this because of all the bad in the world, and they'll say that the loving God would not allow this to happen. So let's first see why this occurs. Everyone wants to know why there's so much bad in the world? Here's your answer. This is a combination of free will and the three laws of the harvest. Free will is easy to explain. God is not withdrawn, but he allows us to make our decisions without his interference. And this right that we have has a caveat. And that caveat are the three laws of the harvest. If I have a handful of wheat seed, I can walk out in the field and put it down, and I know eventually I'm going to have wheat. This is the first law of the harvest. You reap what you sow. However, if I get up the next morning and I walk out and I look out in the field, I'm not going to find any wheat. That's because of the second law of the harvest. You reap later than you sow. Sometimes this delay in reaping gives us a false idea that God is acceptive of what we do when we know it's wrong. And because of that, we continue to reap and we continue to reap. And then the third law of the harvest kicks in. And this is the one that cripples us the most sometimes. You reap greater than you sow. So many sow tares, and they cannot understand why they don't reap wheat. Some knowingly sow tares, and they pray for crop failure. Then when all this is said and done, they want to blame God for what has happened to them instead of looking in the mirror or around them at what they, as well as their friends and acquaintances, are sowing. Because sometimes some of your seed ends up in your acquaintances and friends' fields, and their seed ends up in yours as well. You need to be careful who you hang out with. All this gives people a wrong view of God when they think like this. God made sin possible by giving us a free will. Without free will, we would blindly obey without choice. Free will isn't a bad thing. God did not make Adam sin, but he permitted it. He allows us to live by the laws of the harvest, but he provides a way of escape from the sowing of tares by revealing how to sow wheat instead. And still, he doesn't force this upon us. He doesn't force salvation upon us either, although he did make it the simplest act in the world to simply believe to avoid eternal damnation. He did this by Jesus leaving his throne, coming here, living a perfect life filled with prophetic proof of who he was, allowing himself to be captured, tried, and executed, then raising himself on the third day. This was the greatest gift anyone could give, allowing your one and only son to be beaten, spat upon, mocked, shamed, and then to watch him slowly die while he was mocked and screamed at. All this for people who hated him. One wonders who this was tougher on. The Son for all the excruciating pain and agony he went through, or the Father for not wiping out mankind when this all happened. This greatest gift was made possible by the greatest giver of all, because of an even greater love for every person who has ever and will ever live. Who is the most generous giver? James 1:5. If any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God that giveth to all men liberally, and upbraideth not, and it shall be given him. Question 11. Should there be regular collections in a church? The Hebrews didn't tithe each week because of the complexity of their tithing and of all the goods that are involved. God had set it up in such a way that the Levites, priests, and poor were all taken care of without times of shortfall. There were barns and other ways of storing the surplus, so this was no problem. Some teach that tithing was done once per year. Some say it's more like quarterly. The Bible doesn't seem to spell out the appointed time. Tithes and collections serve different purposes. The first, which we just covered, was to take care of the Levites who received no inheritance except the Lord, that is, tribal land. They lived among the other 12 tribes. Tithing also took care of the priests and the poor. A very small percentage of a tithe was money. Instead, it was a portion of how you were blessed and what you had that increased. So if your goats increased, you didn't tithe the value of the goats, you tithed the goats themselves. New Testament collections were used to help the saints who were persecuted, but the main purpose they served was to finance the Great Commission. And this was strictly money. In the first few chapters of Acts, people didn't give their homes to the church. It's something the Mormons haven't figured out yet. But they did sell their homes or goods and give the money to the church. This money was given as led by the Spirit to help fund missionaries and mission work throughout the world. Should there be regular collections in a church? 1 Corinthians chapter 16:2. Upon the first day of the week, let every one of you lay by him in store, as God hath prospered him, that there be no gatherings when I come. Last question. Should ministers take wages of the church they are ministering to? There are some who think that ministering in a church is about an hour-a-week job. I'm guessing some think that sermons are just a mouse click away, and the hardest task ministers have is to bookmark the scriptures they use for easy and quick access. Ministers spend much time in prayer, submission, prayer, research, more prayer, cross-checking, prayer, studying, even more prayer, proofreading, prayer, and finalizing their sermons. Sometimes after they do all this, God lays a different message on their heart the day of the service, and they have to be ready for that also. This goes on for each service the minister preaches in, 2 or 3 or more times a week. As well, they minister to the sick in the congregation, to those who have special requests or special needs. They witness to the lost in the neighborhood. They answer any questions that members, non-members, and even children have, and they continue doing this on both their good and their bad days. Not every minister is fortunate enough to be a full-time minister. My father did all this while being an automotive mechanic. Ministers have families to feed as well. When it is possible to fully support a minister, this is a wonderful thing. It frees them the same way that deacons freed them back in Acts chapter 6. It allows them more time to fulfill the Great Commission, and this is something every genuine minister should strive to do as well. When the church at Corinth failed to do this for Paul, the church at Philippi stepped in and did this for them. Paul spoke to the Corinthians concerning this later as he wrote to them. Should ministers take wages of the church they are ministering to? 2 Corinthians chapter 11, beginning of verse 8. I robbed other churches, taking wages of them to do you service. And when I was present with you and wanted, I was chargeable to no man, for that which was lacking to me, the brethren which came from Macedonia supplied. And in all things I have kept myself from being burdensome unto you, and so will I keep myself. By the way, the church of Philippi was one of the poorest churches, but you can't believe the blessings they received for doing this. In conclusion, when the collection plate comes around, remember the words of Christ from Matthew 10, verse 8. Freely ye have received, freely give. Simply stated, do not give because you feel obligated to. You're not. This isn't an Old Testament commandment written into the law. We aren't under the law. We're under grace. The local New Testament church does have a right to pay its pastor and its bills, and trustees appreciate this. Its greatest responsibility, however, is to reach the lost, both through the same local church and through its mission work. It is your voluntary giving that makes you a part of the mission work, both here and abroad. And your rewards for this will be greater than you give. In fact, the greater your gift, the greater your reward. Do you want to be blessed? Who doesn't? This promise of God guarantees you a blessing. The operative word here is guarantees. He wants you to prove him. You will never prove him wrong. You will only confirm his promise. This is as close as he's ever going to go to giving you a double dare. Do you want to take him up on it?